Hello, and a very warm welcome to our final broadcast of Ferment TV's launch series. I'm Kit McDonald. I'm the creator of Ginkgo Ferment and the project director of Ferment TV. Per usual, I do have some housekeeping notes before we begin. The session is going to be recorded so that we can share it online afterward. We welcome and encourage audience participation in the chat and Q&A boxes at the bottom of your screen throughout the conversation. Please don't leave your questions to the very last minute, as we'd like to allocate as much time as possible to them. And of course, please be nice to our speakers. And normally, this is the part where I would tell you to stick around until the end to hear about our next broadcast. But seeing as this is our last episode, if you stay put until the end, I might just give you a hint about what else the Ferment TV team has up our sleeves. Maybe. But for those of you who are new to Ferment TV, you've chosen the last episode, perfect timing. We're an experimental space for virtual gatherings by Ginkgo Bioworks, created in partnership with the London-based agency Faber Futures. We foreground multimedia storytelling from the world of synthetic biology, and you're currently tuned in to our launch series. You can visit ferment.tv to learn more about our platform, and go to our YouTube channel to catch up on previous conversations. And now for today's conversation, we're focused on the theme of caretaking, holistic innovation for societal and environmental needs. And switching to gallery view, I'm very pleased to welcome onto our virtual stage today, climate campaigner and writer Alice Bell and senior science reporter at 538.com, Maggie Koerth. Christina Agapakis is moderating. Their conversation will focus on the parallels between COVID-19 and climate change, particularly when it comes to communicating data and uncertainty around these two crises. Dr. Alice Bell is a climate campaigner and writer based in London. She co-runs Possible, a UK charity specializing in public participation with action on climate change. She has a PhD in science communication from Imperial College and lectured on their science communication, MSc, and undergraduate humanities program. She's also worked at Sussex's Science Policy Research Unit, City Journalism School, the Science Museum, and as a freelance writer and editor. Alice is currently writing a book on the history of the climate crisis. Her first book, Can We Save the Planet?, was published earlier this year. Maggie Koerth is the award-winning senior science reporter for 538.com. Previously, she has been a columnist for the New York Times Magazine, the science editor at boingboing.net, and an assistant editor at Mental Floss Magazine. Maggie is a Harvard Nieman Fellow and a member of the board for the member of the board for the Council for the Advancement of Science Writing. And today's moderator, Dr. Christina Agapakis. She's a biologist, writer, and artist interested in microbes and the future of biotechnology. As Ginkgo Bioworks creative director, Christina collaborates with engineers, designers, artists, and social scientists to explore the many unexpected connections between microbiology, technology, art, and pop culture. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Christina.
Thank you so much, Kit, and thanks, Alice and Maggie, for joining us. This is going to be really fun. Although I guess we're talking about things that are like not always fun, right? We're talking about climate change and COVID, some like big, heavy things, right?
Doom
and gloom, but that's kind of what we want to talk about, right? Like how do we communicate about like difficult topics, right? And how do we talk about the science of these complicated things, and how does that science kind of leave the lab and go out into the public sphere, and how we kind of think about things. So maybe a place to start is to actually kind of think about that transformation of science from in the lab, like out into the world. You both think about the public understanding of science from different perspectives. So maybe, I don't know, who should start? Maybe Alice, as the academic of public understanding of science, like what is public understanding of science? Like ground us there, and then we can start digging into the
loaded term, which means lots of different things for different people. And people have like since the 50s hung whatever their like anxiety about the world is onto this term of public understanding of science. Like it's going to save us. If we can improve this, all the other problems would go away. But then they didn't necessarily know what this thing was, other than that it was going to be all their hopes and dreams and solutions. And so then they'd hang other like ideas on it. But it generally means the idea of like improving the knowledge of people who aren't scientists, or people who are scientists but their knowledge of other fields. So like if you're a microbiologist, you're still kind of the public in respect to being a geophysicist, maybe, unless you're doing something actually that relates to that intersection between the two. And I guess it's sort of become less fashionable to talk about public understanding of science, particularly in Europe in the last 20 years or so, longer than that even actually. People like to think more about the thing that they realize is that after years of trying to solve the problem by like saying we need to fix the public, they're the problem, they realize that actually it's about the relationship between the two, and that there's things that science need to fix, but also we just need to stop looking at these two entities as separate and think about their interrelation and how they can interact, so that, you know, scientists can be challenged by other people, how they can be excited by them, they can, you know, and the people who aren't scientists can be challenged and excited by science, and that they can have a conversation. So I guess that's kind of the kind of overview of what the public understanding of science is. A lot of my colleagues in the UK would spit at the phrase public understanding of science. It's very unfashionable.
Well, that's interesting. I sort of still think of like the US being in this space where we kind of have this, I don't know, like technocratic undercurrent to a lot of our, like you kind of have this framework where like you have technocrats versus know-nothings in the political frame. And it kind of often gets framed around the idea that like, well, if we just educated people more, or if people just listened to science, then we would solve our problems and we wouldn't have a problem. And or these other people are anti-science and they're against science, and as though like science is an oppressed class. And that is such an interesting framework, I think, and a misleading one. And we often end up in this place where we're having these arguments as though they are about facts, when what they're actually about is ideology.
That's super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it is. And like it's like it's I think that we kind of get into these places where we want to convince people of something that they already believe. They just disagree that that's the important thing. Like a few years ago, when I was doing my Neiman Fellowship, I did a paper for a class at Harvard that was looking at 30 years of reporting on, on vaccine controversies in the New York Times. And one of the things that I kind of kept seeing over and over again was, the scientists and the reporters framing these stories around like, well, if people just understood the science, they would understand how important vaccines were. And if they just understood what the risks of these diseases were, they would support vaccination. And then they would talk to these people who were anti-vaccine, and they weren't talking about the science at all. They were talking about like, basically like this kind of libertarian politics thing of like, the government shouldn't have the right to tell me what to do with my body. And because they were having these two completely different arguments, you had the scientists basically like talking over and around, but never actually engaging with what these anti-vaccine people were really worried about. And I think like that kind of issue gets into some really interesting places where we assume that it's just education that people are lacking, when sometimes it's just a very different worldview and two different worldviews clashing, and you can't really solve that with more facts.
It's going to be so important in the future. I mean, vaccines is already such a big important issue,
right?
Anyway,
Yeah,
it's about to get even worse,
exactly.
Isn't it? I totally agree. I think there's also a way in which, like, people say this anti-science thing, like you're anti-science, and often people aren't, and it gets used as a kind of rhetorical tool, which then divides people and gets them into camps that then they find it hard to escape from.
Right.
But I think there is something it's worth appreciating some of the, like, one of the things I've really learned from studying the history of the climate crisis and all the discourse around that in the last like 30 years has been the way, something I didn't really appreciate too much until I started doing that project, was this kind of back history to what we now think of as the climate skeptics. And the groups like the George C. Marshall Institute, they're sometimes known as like the doubt mongers. They're the people who were seen as deliberately sowing doubt. And some of them, actually, the people who founded the George C. Marshall Institute, they genuinely believed that what they were doing was right. But one of their reasons for doing it was there were these group of quite high profile, powerful physicists, some of which who'd worked on climate stuff, who had become convinced that American science in particular had been taken over by communists. It was this kind of like Reds under the beds thing. They thought that the Union of Concerned Scientists were a load of lefties. A lot of them had been really hurt by the student protests in '68 and the push against militarization of science that happened in a lot of campuses in the States then. And they'd grown up as scientists working with the military. They were like proper, you know, they'd served in the World War II, and then they'd gone and helped build with Vannevar Bush and all the other groups this like Cold War science. They did a lot of work with the military, a lot of like basic science that got funded by the military that helped us discover the climate crisis. We would not know about the climate crisis probably at any of the level that we do as soon as we did, really, if it hadn't been for like early science in the 50s. It was all military funded. And then they were finding in the '68 that they were being told that what they did was wrong. And so they had built this like very defensive relationship often with some of their colleagues, and they started to feel like they were being conspired against. And this idea that they felt they were doing right-wing science that they felt was truthful science, and that they felt everyone else was doing left-wing science. And then you get the Reagan White House and then the H. Bush White House going, this is our science, because it was coming from legit professors in many ways. And now we look back on it and go, they were terrible, like climate skeptics. But it's really important, I think, for us to appreciate that there was this sort of split of differences of politics, which led to a different way of thinking about science, which has created some like really dangerous divides in the world. Because we're still living with the legacies of that.
Well, and there's a lot of classes of science where you get into things like this. Like, I've done a lot of reporting on gun violence, and in the US you have these different ways of looking at gun violence research. You know, you can look at it through the lens of criminology, or you can look at it through the lens of public health research. And those are both two legitimate ways to study it, but they've gotten kind of politicized because if you're looking at it as a public health problem, that's seen by, you know, some gun rights advocates in the US as inherently saying that guns are bad. And if you're only looking at it as a criminology problem, that's looked at by other, you know, by like gun control advocates in the US as saying that you think the only problem with guns is crime. And like, it kind of like leaves out accidents, and it leaves out like both perspectives end up leaving these sort of blank spaces in what we know. And you kind of need both of them to understand what's actually going on, but they both become so politicized that, you know, some different people look at these different aspects as illegitimate.
Well, maybe actually that's a question that I have, this kind of question of politicization versus like people's perspectives that they're bringing that may or may not be political, right? So I think, you know, we started talking about this kind of the perhaps like bad term of public understanding of science, and this idea that you know, scientists think that we need to educate people, or that the problem is maybe we need to change the way we phrase things to be more interesting to get those facts into people. But in fact, there's something else going on about like what perspective we bring, and then that even within the scientific community, there's different perspectives, which then put us into camps, right? So I guess like, when does science like, is there like a moment at which science becomes politicized, or is there something else about sort of like recognizing like the sort of this question of values around science from the beginning?
I mean, I think both, right? Like, so one of the problems with the idea of, I have a lot of problems with the idea of objectivity. That's going to be on my Festivus poll this year and every year. And the issue is that like objectivity in one sense is a really important thing in that, you know, if you're doing reporting, if you're doing science, you don't want somebody to go in with a foregone conclusion and just be trying to prove that. You want them to actually be exploring all of these options and trying to get different perspectives and trying to understand what's actually happening and get as close to the truth as possible. But false objectivity is this thing we get into in both journalism and science, where we assume that we can have a viewpoint that is neutral. And the reality is that every viewpoint has a bias to it, and not necessarily like a nefarious, I'm sitting over here plotting your downfall bias, but like a bias that makes assumptions about how the world works, that makes assumptions about what's important, that puts value on some things and less value on others. And we all bring that to the table no matter what we're doing. And when you don't look at that bias, or when you ignore that bias or pretend it's not there to start off with, you're really missing like some important aspects of what's going on. And like in that sense, science is always inherently a political thing, because you're always making some sort of value judgment, some sort of bias that you're bringing to the table when you're doing science. In the other hand, science gets politicized when we start layering other meanings, other assumptions on top of the data. So like, for instance, with COVID, you know, a lot of reporting that I've been doing has been around mask use and sort of what we actually know about how well masks, particularly the homemade masks, the DIY masks, what we actually know about how well those are protecting people, what contexts they are protective in, how well they are protective, that kind of thing. And in the US, I don't know if it's the same way in the UK right now, we've gotten to this point and been there since April, where whether the way that you are telling people to wear masks and whether you're saying like, oh my God, this is the most important thing in the entire world and you have to do this right now, or whether you're saying like, okay, here's this nuance, that can get interpreted in very different ways, because we have taken the idea of whether you're wearing a mask or not wearing a mask as a political stance, as a stance that then implies all of these other things that you must also believe that have nothing to do with COVID, that have nothing to do with, you know, epidemiology. And that makes it really complicated to actually explain uncertainty and to explain how science actually works. Because if you're telling people that, when I am telling people that, you know, there's a lot we actually don't know about how well masks work, and particularly how well a DIY cloth mask works, but you should wear it anyway. I get pushback from the one hand of being people assuming that then I believe you shouldn't ever wear masks and that I am backing up different political ideas that have nothing to do with masks at all. And then I get also pushback from another group saying that like, if I don't say you have to wear masks, I'm, you know, that's a problem too. So like you get it kind of like from both sides, because they're expecting these absolute answers that line up with all of these other things that aren't even related to the subject at hand.
And I think we should be careful of not just seeing values and politics as always a bad thing. Like it is something that I think it behooves journalists and scientists to see their politics and see their values, and as much as possible remove them, because we're trying to see, you know, objectivity may not be possible. We want to strive to be as close to it as possible, or we want to, you know, see the world with as much accuracy as we can and understand other people's perspectives, and escape our own. I guess it's part of that process of escaping just your own little tight bubble that your body and your brain and your history has put you in. But I think, like, particularly I noticed this in climate and quite a lot of health stuff. Sometimes you see scientists owning their values and going, yeah, like this is the stuff I know because it's science and I've tested it with other people, and I think that this isn't just my view, this is you know, reverse stuff.
Right.
But also because of that, and because I'm also a whatever, I want to do this thing. Like we've had with the Extinction Rebellion protests, there's been a group within Extinction Rebellion that's Extinction Rebellion scientists, and it's really interesting to watch them like they go, we're scared because we're scientists and we know some of this stuff that other people don't have to look at in this detail. I mean, they're not all climate scientists, but I mean, a lot of them are medics as well. And, you know, you see people taking their specialist knowledge that they have from their professional career but explicitly mixing it with politics that they're owning that politics. And some people get really scared of it. Like I remember when we first had one of the protest marches, like Stand Up for Science protest marches years ago, as like early phase of these. And there were loads of people who were like, what if the scientists go on a march? Will people stop believing us? And we're like, you're going on a march to ask for money. I think they know that you like money. I think that's okay. But like, there was this fear that like, oh, if we did a thing that looked political, we get the political lurgies on it and all of our credibility would dissolve. I'm like, dude, do you really think your credibility is so like loosely formed that holding a placard asking for some more funding because you think that doing research into cancer is a good thing is you know, it's gonna leave you absent? So yeah, I think we should be careful of it's really easy for us to like go, this is bad, and demonize it, and I think that's a default setting. And I think we have to try and think about how that doesn't mean it's a good thing, and like that we should corrupt science and politics, but at the same time we can own them, we can own our values.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true. And I think like one thing that has been interesting for me, so like the other thing I've been reporting on a lot this summer has been sociology research around crime and around police brutality in the US, different things like that. And one of the things that it seems like a lot of the researchers in that field are sort of trying to do is expand this bubble out more so that they're understanding that like all of the data that we have on crime, or at least the vast majority of it, is coming directly from police reports, and starting to sort of grapple with the fact that those police reports are not necessarily accurate because the police are not themselves a inerrant source of information about their own behavior. And like, how do we study this thing accurately when the source of information is a political organization that we are sort of trained to treat as an objective source of information, but it's not. And like, that's something that we have to grapple with a lot in journalism as well. And that I think particularly journalism is just sort of trying to get its feet underneath of it on how to write about the police behavior without just putting out well, the police said this about themselves, so obviously that's the fact. And I think that makes it tough. And I think that makes it important to not necessarily think of like that changing your viewpoint at looking at it from different viewpoints is maybe what the true objectivity is, of like sort of trying to get as many of those bubbles into one place into your brain as you can, is maybe a better way to look at it than just trying to have a completely neutral viewpoint, because when you're completely neutral, you're going to miss some of those perspectives and really miss important facts.
It's interesting. It seems like there's a few things that you're both touching on in terms of sort of like how scientists, but also journalists, right, like are sort of maybe perhaps like trained to, or like believe they must communicate certain kinds of things that can often like backfire, right? So one of them is this like notion of sort of objectivity, like removing or sort of like ignoring kind of any kind of political perspectives or sort of like questions of values or sort of assuming they're not there. Another being like this question of uncertainty, like, you know, you want to be able to communicate like, these are the facts, right? Like, and we sort of keep, it seems like reinscribing that, right? Like, look at the facts, right? And then you're like, oh no, the facts are different now because science changes new facts. And so you have to be like, no, these are the facts now, right? Rather than say like, you know, rather than trying to find more nuance there about like, you know, maybe there's something there to kind of pick on. And then the other one might be a sort of question of like, it connects to that kind of question of like activism, right? Of like, you know, what is the kind of like recommendation that you might be giving, or like, it comes up with the kind of the question of like alarmism too, like, you know, like how much should scientists be sort of give, you know, they say a fact, something that they've discovered, we've noticed, like what is it that we are sort of like recommending, right? So maybe like the image I have in my mind is of like the scientist in the sort of 90s action movie, like natural disaster forecast, or like, everybody, something's coming, right? Like, you know, and they're often like the crank scientist, right? So like, and that is very, like a very powerful image for us, right? Like we need to be sort of like, yeah, like, steadfast, strong, like not, or else like, yeah, I don't know. So there's something about like what we think of as the scientist, and how they're supposed to act, versus how we sort of end up acting, and then how that sort of travels in the
I
public.
think this has been a really big issue in climate change. I think we're seeing it now, like it's a lot, any climate nerds will know this is an ongoing issue that everyone in climate nerds like to talk about, and sometimes peters out into the broader world as well, but they're having another one of their periodic fights over this at the moment, which is about alarmism. You know, like the David Wallace Wells "we're all going to die" thing, and like, is that, and or some of the stuff you get from XR, or some of the things that I think Greta Thunberg has like pushed people to talk differently about it, and whether this is a good thing. And on the other side, you've got people saying no, that this is wrong, it's scaring people, and especially when you're talking about stuff like we've got 12 years and then humanity will go. You're like, well, no, it's not that bad, but like that doesn't mean it's okay,
right?
But you get this, there's been some sociology of science research that would suggest that climate scientists have, as a tendency, erred on the side of less drama. Now, this is really difficult because it's a really subjective thing. Like, we've talked about the difficulties of like any kind of scientist studying stuff, but like it becomes really tricky for a social scientist doing this sort of thing. Like how you decide that a scientist has under dramatized something. It's like it's a hard thing to, but anyway, there's some research that they argue that suggests that climate scientists have erred on the side of least drama, and that's something that I would say from my historical research is something that does resonate. Like, that really does feel like that's something that's happened, and I can see why it's happened. Why, like you were saying, like this is what you're taught is how to be a scientist is you have to be like calm, but sometimes that's not truthful.
Detached,
because
maybe.
It's alarming, you know, there's a comet coming, climate change. I think we all went through, like when COVID, like all the stories about COVID are coming, you know, like we were reading about the cases in China and Italy and stuff. A lot of us would have had these conversations with our friends, like how scared is it? And do we feel like we don't want to be chicken little, we don't want to be crying wolf? And there's this more of a fear of being proved wrong and having looked alarmist than there is of a fear of having got it wrong and actually then not protected yourself, which seems really wrong. But culturally, particularly I think around cultures of science, we seem to have got to a place where people are more happy to be proved wrong that things were worse than the other way around, which is maybe not really very good for the future of humanity. But,
well, I think like COVID particularly like falls into this weird gray area where it is a serious pandemic that's killing lots and lots of people, and also, and like is worse than flu, but is also simultaneously not like smallpox, right? So I think that there is this desire to have it be fine, or oh my God, the end of the world. And if it's not oh my God, the end of the world, then it must be fine. And like people have a really hard time figuring out how to sit in the in-between space. And like I think that that's true also with just like we don't actually know what the answer is. People have a hard time sitting in the in-between space, and that COVID seems to have just presented one situation after another where you kind of have to sit with uncertainty and just deal with it. You know, like it's that way around masks. It's that way around like how we count deaths. It's that way around like what the R is, you know, like what the R not is. It's that way around like just all of these different things, these different aspects of this disease. And so I've talked to a lot of people, and like, you know, even other journalists who cover this are like, I constantly feel like I'm gaslighting myself, like this virus is gaslighting me. And like, I am just, I don't know whether I'm overreacting or underreacting on any given day. And I think that that's a really tough place to be. And I'm sort of curious about like what research, if there's any research that you know, Alice, about just like the human desire for absolute answers, and like our inability to just wrestle with and sit with, we don't know, maybe it's this.
yeah, it's not my area, but it's it is like Yeah, I agree. I haven't got any good papers for you because it's not my area, sorry.
Oh, that's
But
okay.
yeah, I think it is. It's like that. How do we manage that? But then it's also like how we manage it through the professional identities. I think that's another stage of it. I think behind it is this larger like humanities, a problem for humanity. But I think behind that, there's in front of that, there is this thing that it's sort of woven its way through into becoming like a particular way in which you're meant to present yourself in the face of uncertainty for journalism and for science and for several other kind of politicians as well. Like I think we expect a really weird approach to certainty from politicians, which is not necessarily helpful for having good science policy.
I wonder, like, yeah, I think for me, it's like anytime there's a binary, you should be suspicious, right? Like anytime it's like either or, like you're for us, you're with us, you're against us. Like there's probably something more complicated going on, and then you need to like dig in deep. And but like that either or, that like one or the other, black or white, like is so powerful somehow still. So like there is something there. I wonder, like it goes back to again that question of sort of like the character of the scientist and like how we're trained to. Yuri Alon is a scientist, and he's given a TED talk that's quite good, where he talks about sort of, we think of science as like the thing that finds the answers, and like you go from like you have a question and you answered it and we solved it, you got the answer, and any practicing scientist would know that that's total bullshit, and that we actually spend a lot of time having no idea what's going on, right? But because we have this sort of cultural ideas like this, emotionally detached, like solution finder, like answer finder as the scientist, that like what happens is people actually end up like going through this experience of like very, very traumatic experience, often as you know, for graduate student, where you're like, I don't know what's going on. I must not be a good scientist, and because I'm like feeling really bad about it, like, and I'm not supposed to have emotions because I'm supposed to be like rational. I'm the scientist, and it speaks to other kinds of binaries, right? So it's like there's a masculine rationality and like feminine like emotion, and like the sort of the scientist and the non-scientist, right? And all of these divisions that we draw. But in fact, like there's something in the middle, right? So maybe the question or something to think about is like, how do we start to get at that middle, right? Like, is there a way out? What's the way through? Like, or what do you do in your practices and like the things that you do to get out of these?
My editor tells me that the thesis of my stories can't be, it's complicated. But my general goal in life is to continue to prove him wrong and have all of the thesis of my stories be it's complicated. Just like sneak it in there.
But I think that's sustainable that people come to the end of these things and they'll be like, well, what do I do? Like, I mean, and this is a challenge you see with a lot of the science policy stuff happening around COVID, and has been a continual issue for climate change. It's like the scientists go, well, I've got this variable and this model and this set of probabilities. You know, they're both controversies that are around a lot of modeling. And, you know, the modelers are very good at what they do, and they've not only made very good models, but they've also got a sense of going, well, we think this percentage of probability and this percentage of probability. And a decent politician who's adept at working with these scientists will have learned to read this stuff, but they have to get up on a podium and give people an answer. And it is understandable that people, they can still hold in their head masks are complicated, but they still need a decision about whether to wear one when they go out. And I mean, maybe what it is, it's about thinking about how science policy infrastructure can just help people with like, well, these are the decisions you need to make in that uncertainty thing. It's like, what are the risks and discomfort of taking a mask versus what are the risks and discomforts of not doing it? And you're like, well, how do you feel about your role in the precautionary principle here? Like there was, like with climate change, there was a lot of stuff about, you know, what if we get it wrong? And like, climate change doesn't hit and we've just destroyed capitalism. Understandably, there were a lot of people who were not into that in the 80s, but that meant that there was a reason why they didn't want to act. So there was a lot of, you read the documents that was being circulated around the oil industry in the late 80s, and they're saying, you know, we don't want the government to make drastic decisions that were going to cost us a lot of money. But you're like, if you're taking a more kind of precautionary perspective, you're like, yeah, but if you don't do this, you're going to end up as screwed as they are in the 21st century, which is what we're now living in. The same thing, you know, like, I don't know what I appreciate that the mask discourse in the US is much more volatile and difficult than it is over in the UK. But like a lot of the stuff we've been having is people pushing going like, how much does it hurt to wear a mask? You know, maybe it won't do that much good, but you know, it's not going to hurt you
I mean, I think that like one of the things that like we kind of talked about, like the expectations about like how science works. And I think like this is one of those places where, you know, basic science education kind of undercuts actual science understanding, because when you're in school, what you're learning science as is a series of facts to be memorized. And what you're learning it as is like an absolute thing. And like, we know this is true. And that's not actually how science works. And it's definitely not how science works when you're doing brand new science. And so you get into these situations where like my readers see changing understanding of a brand new disease as flip-flopping, as like, oh, the scientists don't know what they're talking about. Well, yeah, of course they don't know what they're talking about. It's a brand new I'm not going to swear, it's a brand new disease. And like the process of discovery is itself this messy space where you're going to have to be like, oh, okay, that was wrong. Oh, okay, I need to go this direction. And that's the only way that you actually get closer to truth. But because we've taught science as a fact and not a process, we end up with this thing where it becomes a belief system and not a, okay, well, let's go do our process.
I wonder actually, so the theme, we have 5 themes, I think, for, Kit can jump in and tell me at the end that I was wrong, but I think we have 5 themes that we've kind of pulled out of these conversations. And our theme today is caretaking. And I wonder if there is something here about like this question of care, that if you approach things from a point of view of care rather than a question of control, that maybe there's something there, right? So I think we want control, right? Like, tell me what to do so I can stop the virus, or like, tell me what I can do to not change anything about anything, but stop climate change,
Yeah.
right? But in fact, like, yeah, because things are complicated, because we don't have a lot of certainty, like we're going to have to make decisions that kind of center a kind of question of care, right? Like, how do we, oh yeah, thank you, Kit. How do we like work together and care for each other, like given these uncertainties, and care enough to kind of follow through and change course as things change, right? So I'm wondering if there's something there too, or like how might we think about communicating from that point of or perspective of care?
I mean, I think that control issue is such a good point. You know, I was thinking about that earlier this week because there are some scientists on Twitter who have taken, like, this, it's not necessarily their field is not epidemiology, but that they've taken a very like, COVID is not a problem, you guys are just making it be a problem when it's not actually a problem kind of perspective. And in some of the tweets that I was reading this week, like they were sort of talking about people's need to, like people who are concerned about COVID as a real threat, as just like wanting to have control over everything. But I think that it's actually true both ways. Like there is a sense of control you get from wanting like a hard and fast set of rules that you can follow that will make the virus go away. And there's also this sense of control that you get from just being like, everything's fine, I'm in control of the situation, we know that there's not actually a problem, why don't you see that? And I think that the harder place is where you don't have control. The harder place is where like, well, we don't actually have great rules that we can tell you that are going to make this perfect. We don't have a way to like shore up normal life and also, you know, reduce viral risk. And how much should we reduce viral risk? We don't actually have an answer to that. You know, like there's not having answers and accepting the lack of absolute answers is the loss of control. And that's, I think, a much scarier place for people to be. And I think it's also that place where you need that caretaking. I mean, we saw this, I think, a lot with like the process of schools reopening in the US, where, you know, do you shut everything down entirely and you do just online? Do you open everything entirely and pretend that there's not really actually a problem? And what we didn't see a lot of was figuring out how we can do caretaking to make sure that the people who are being left behind and underserved and honestly like really screwed over by the steps that we need to take to reduce viral spread of like shutting down the schools, how those people are being taken care of. Like there's been very little planning for that kind of option. It's been framed as one or the other. And I think that's the real problem that you get to when you want to have it be a thing you can control, but not a thing that you caretake for.
Yeah, I was thinking something very similar, which is that it would be what I'd like to see happening more in stuff that campaigners do, but also journalists and scientists do, is bring the voices of people who are going to be most hurt by something, like whatever side of your risk thing, like, telling the stories of people who can't wear masks. Like there are people who can't wear masks, so they need to, we need to have a social, we can't be in a society where it's socially unacceptable not to wear a mask, because that would potentially isolate them. Also, people who want to lip read, or like schools, so many issues around that, but also like who's going to be more affected who's going to be hurt the most. And they're nearly always the people who are going to be most hurt by something, like any of these biological, medical, physical risks that we're worrying about, whether it's climate or COVID, nearly always the people who are least listened to either. And so it's something that I think it's worth doing in your quest for like towards objectivity as a scientist or a journalist, is to like bulk up those voices that aren't normally heard and tell the stories that don't normally get told. And as you said, actually, Maggie, with the stuff you've been doing on crime stuff, that's another really, really good example, because we get a full sense of objectivity because there's a whole load of voices that are ignored. And I think that we can do better caregiving if we come from that perspective. I mean, that there's also like relates to kind of fights you have in science policy about whether you take the sort of precautionary principle or wait and see approach. And lots of people who kind of form this idea of the precautionary principle, which is like, if you kind of side on the be careful side, really, is that they do it because they know that if a risk happens, if a hazard happens, they'll be the most vulnerable who are likely to get hit, and they won't necessarily be in a position to fight back or protect themselves. And that's why people, it's kind of encapsulated in some formal bits of EU policy and stuff, but that's why this idea of the precautionary principle really emerged in the first place. It's become a much bigger fight over various different things since, but I think it's worth us remembering that and kind of thinking, well, like, whatever approach we take, whether it's precautionary or something else, like how are we thinking about those people who are not going to be able to speak, or not going to be heard, because speak most of the time, just no one listens.
Maybe it's a good time to transition to one of the questions in the Q&A, which I think follows from this directly, which is, do you think the Global South is most of the time left out of the conversation around decision-making on climate change? And how can we kind of bring more perspectives from different parts of the world into that conversation around the science and the politics of climate change?
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's those people in the Global North that could do with listening to voices from the Global South more. And I think it's something that scientist communities should actually be very good at doing. Like, it's obviously we should demand better of our media and stuff. Like, it's actually something that scientists could do more easily, because they're potentially a very internationalist group. But then a lot of the scientific resources are kind of concentrated in the Global North, and it's officially part of some forms of the UN climate policy stuff that's to do with international collaboration and ways in which, particularly with technological innovation, that richer countries will work with other countries. I'm actually involved in a project running out of University College London just recently, to be connecting universities around the world, lots of different universities from very different types of country, and about what they're doing about climate change in their area with their communities and how they can collaborate. But there could be so much more on that. And I mean, it's the other group I think also is climate campaigners, which is that they're a stream of science communicators often that kind of get forgotten sometimes, because we see them as like other, because they're campaigners, but they are science communicators a lot of the time. And the big international NGOs, like people like World Wildlife Fund, they do put work into thinking about how they move resources to boost voices from parts of the world that would otherwise be ignored by the richer countries. Groups like 350 do this quite a lot, but I think they could do it a lot more.
I mean, I think that like the global South gets left out of a lot of these discussions. That people there have a stakeholder position in. I mean, there's been some really good reporting, I think particularly in Science magazine, about the way that vaccines for COVID are sort of becoming like a nationalist deal, with a lot of the big economies sort of already locking down these contracts with the companies that are working on creating vaccines, where there just may not be actually vaccine available for countries in the global South. And you can get in these situations where, you know, very low risk populations in the US are getting vaccinated before medical workers in, you know, in Kenya or, you know, Argentina, right? So that is, I think, these are, I think, real problems that we run into. And I think they are kind of a direct result of not having enough viewpoints in mind when we're thinking about these problems. You know, if we are assuming that there is one perspective that is correct and it is ours, well, that leaves out the other perspectives that we aren't listening to.
So we started out with kind of, yeah, talking about sort of like public understanding, right? And how still I think there is this kind of undercurrent, whether it's popular in different parts of the world or not, of sort of like, okay, well, we just need people to understand something different and like that, and it'll fix the problem. Or we just need to change the way that scientists communicate, and that'll fix the problem. And so, yeah, I almost phrased my question as like, what should we do to fix the problem? But it seems like there is a sort of like higher order question, right? Of like, what do we do to start to kind of like change? What are things that we can start to do to shift these things and shift these perspectives and bring more people in, right? Another question from our Q&A is this: science communication is almost always about problems instead of solutions. How can we change science communication to give people things that they need to do to learn, to figure out how to solve problems? Like, is that one way, right? Like, how do we bring more people into this kind of question of like problem finding, problem making, problem solving? And yeah, maybe like, yeah, and sort of our last few minutes here, like, where do we go from here?
I love that question, because that's the charity I work for, Possible, is based on the idea that we should engage people with actions they can take on climate change rather than the problems, which isn't to say that shouting climate change is bad is a thing that people shouldn't do, because we need to know it's bad, and there's like an understanding issue around that. But like other people like a lot of the work on climate change is focused around telling people it's bad, look at the iceberg. And we're like, well, that only gets you so far. That often, if you stay with that, actually emotionally, you're not going to go much further. You're just really depressed. And so the way that we can build sustained, like, and build a movement and give people a chance to fight over how we build this new world, rather than just like, oh, we should do something about it, but like how we do something about it. There are lots of different choices, and that's very political, and people should have a say in it. So we do projects that allows people to be involved in that sort of stuff. So we get communities working together to we're doing a project to get communities installing heat pumps under local parks, which will give money for the local park, but will also allow them all to have a conversation about renewable heat and think about how most of the heat in the UK comes from gas, and learn about this technology that most people who live in a city in the UK have never encountered, a heat pump. If you've never encountered a heat pump, look them up, they're amazing. They're the future. Or they're a bit of the future for bits of it. But yeah, that's exactly what we do, is we try and find something that is it's not a solution, because you can't solve climate change, because that ship sailed a long time ago, but it's a way of tackling it. And we can get people to work on that, and people find hope in that, and they find community, and they find a way of sustenance and of keeping going. And like, I've worked a lot in science communication projects. I've tried to do this with all sorts of other things, and there's all sorts of amazing ways in which people love getting involved in the problem, even when it's not something like we're all going to save the world or tackle climate change. When it's something really abstract, like that's just for fun, for joy, because they really love spotting galaxies and stuff. And I think, yeah, I think that projects that that involve people in the problem solving and allow them to work as a community to do that are key. They're not everything. Like, we still need beautiful science writing, and beautiful science. Like, there isn't a problem with people telling people stuff. That's wonderful and beautiful and important, but it can't be all of it. So yeah, I'm totally with you, George. We need projects which bring people together to work on like actions.
I think we're getting close to the end, so I like to ask people sort of, like, what makes you, there is a lot of doom and gloom. We're talking about dark things and heavy things, but I love, Alice, like there's also, there's room for hope and things that we can do. So when you, maybe like a last thought to leave us with, like when you think about the future, what does make you hopeful, or what are you kind of thinking about for, the next 30 years, the next 100 years, right? Like what's a kind of, is there a hopeful note we can leave on today?
I have a lot of hope and curiosity. I have a lot of hope in the way that I see people getting excited to learn about the things they didn't know, which is very often the nuance, right? That the nuance isn't boring or too in the weeds for anyone to care about, that the nuance is itself this really interesting thing where people learn something and they come away energized about having known a thing they didn't know before. And I think like that's important. That is hopeful, and I am excited to sort of continue to be a part of that.
I just say that I find that the term hope has just become so loaded within climate stuff that I find it very difficult to work with. I spent lots of years working with it, trying to find hope, talk to other people about their hope, and it just felt empty because it is difficult, because it's in this difficult middle area. Like you can't win on climate change because we've already lost. So there is like some really deep tragedy at the bottom of the climate change, but that doesn't mean you can't wake up the next morning. So instead of thinking about hope, what I generally do is I follow something that was I think was put really beautifully by a climate scientist called Kate Marvel, which is to think about climate courage instead. And that has opened up whole new ways of me thinking about like how I work with communities to help them think about how they're going to lift their community to do something amazing that's going to solve other problems as well as tackle climate change at the same time. And how, if I am writing a bit of text, like I'm writing this book about the depressing history of how we haven't done anything on climate change, like how can I leave people feeling like, all right, this is bad, this is depressing, but I have courage. And so I don't necessarily have any particular tricks up my sleeve for having courage right now, other than working with other people and doing a thing with other people will have so much power for helping you get up the next morning. Like I think that's a tip for doing it, but also just thinking, I have found the process of thinking about courage rather than hope really helpful.
I love that. That's great.
That is really cool.
Let's leave that, like, and let's go off and be courageous together and care together. And thank you, Alice. Thank you, Maggie. This was really, really wonderful, inspiring. I feel more courageous. And I'll hand it back to Kit to sign.
Oh, I don't want this episode to end. Again, I just want to echo Christina's sentiments in thanking both of you, Alice and Maggie, and of course, thank you, Christina, for moderating today. I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank the Faber Futures team for their thought and production partnership in this entire endeavor. Natsai Cheza, Laura Vent, Joanna Mann, Camille Thierry, and Magda Olmalko. And of course, I'd also like to thank everyone in our audience for today in your participation, but also for the last 12 weeks. This series really wouldn't have existed without your participation and engagement and critical questions. But the fun does not end here. The Ferment TV team is going to take a short summer recess, and we will be returning to the metaphorical office now in September to get cooking on the next steps of this project. So I've received some eager inquiries on what that might be. And I'm leaving it intentionally very vague in saying that our speakers haven't been wearing those high-tech microphones just to make a fashion statement. But I'd also like to thank our speakers for agreeing to wear them. But of course, you can stay up to date on our upcoming announcements by visiting ferment.tv to subscribe to our newsletter, which of course I promise is not used to spam you. It's just to share some updates when we have them. And you can also follow us on Instagram at ferment.tv, where we'll also be sharing upcoming news. And finally, if you're looking to fill the new void in your week where Ferment TV has been, you can always revisit past episodes on our YouTube channel and see conversation highlights on our Instagram stories. So with that, thank you for joining us today and for the past 12 weeks, and we will see you soon. Bye.